My name is Casey Thorne, and I was 12 years old the summer I nearly did not make it out of the Blackmore house alive. I grew up in a small town in southern Indiana called Millhaven, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair, and where every single kid in town grew up hearing the same story, whispered on school buses and around campfires, about the house at the end of Cutler Road. I am telling this now because I promised myself, on the worst night of my life, that if I ever made it out of that house, I would tell the truth about what happened there, no matter how impossible it sounds. This is that truth, exactly as I remember it, and I have never once wished I could forget it, though there have been many nights I wished I could. The Blackmore house had stood empty for as long as anyone in Millhaven could remember. It sat back from Cutler Road behind a wall of overgrown trees, a tall 3-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that had long since collapsed on one side, its white paint peeling away in long gray strips like dead skin. The story everyone told was always slightly different depending on who was talking, but the core of it never changed. Sometime in the 1950s, a family named Blackmore had lived there, a mother, a father, and 3 children, and one winter they simply stopped being seen in town. No one ever found bodies. No one was ever charged with anything. The house had simply sat there ever since, passed between distant relatives who never once visited, taxes paid quietly by someone nobody could ever name. My 2 best friends were Marcus Webb and Ellie Duncan, and the 3 of us had been inseparable since the 2nd grade, bonded by nothing more complicated than living on the same street and liking the same cartoons. Marcus was the boldest of us, always the first to suggest something reckless, always convinced that nothing bad could ever really happen to him. Ellie was the smartest, the one who read every book she could get her hands on, including a worn library copy of a book about local Indiana ghost stories that she carried around that entire summer like a sacred text. I was somewhere in between the 2 of them, brave enough to follow along but never quite brave enough to lead, which is a distinction that matters a great deal when I think back on everything that happened. It was the last week of June, the kind of stretch of summer where the days feel endless and a little bit dangerous, when Marcus first brought up the idea of actually going inside the Blackmore house. We were sitting on the curb outside the gas station on Main Street, sharing a bag of sour candy, when he said it, almost casually, like he was suggesting we ride our bikes to the creek instead. He said his older cousin had gone inside 2 summers before on a dare and had come out white-faced and refused to talk about what he saw for almost a year afterward. Ellie's eyes lit up at that, the way they always did when a story got interesting, and she immediately started asking questions Marcus could not answer, which only seemed to make her more determined to go find out the truth herself. I remember feeling a cold and immediate reluctance the moment Marcus suggested it, a feeling in my stomach that I did not have words for yet but that I now recognize as instinct, the same kind of instinct that keeps animals away from certain parts of the forest. I tried to talk them out of it, pointing out that the house was on private property, that we could get in serious trouble if anyone caught us, that there were plenty of other things we could do with our summer that did not involve trespassing into a place with a reputation like that one had. Neither of them listened to me. Ellie was already flipping through her ghost story book, looking for the chapter on Blackmore, and Marcus was grinning in that way he always did right before he talked me into something I would regret. We settled on a date 2 days later, a Saturday, reasoning that our parents would be less likely to notice 3 extra hours of us being gone on a weekend when everyone was busy with yard work and errands. Ellie spent the 2 days in between reading everything she could find about the house, coming to school the next week, even though it was summer and there was no school, just to tell us what she had learned from an old newspaper archive at the library. She told us that in addition to the missing family, there had been at least 2 reported disappearances near the property over the following decades, teenagers mostly, kids who had gone in on dares just like we were planning to do, never to be seen again. I remember asking her if that did not seem like a good reason to stay away. She just smiled and said that was exactly what made it worth seeing for ourselves. The morning of that Saturday arrived gray and overcast, the sky pressing low over Millhaven in a way that felt, in hindsight, like some kind of warning nobody bothered to heed. I told my mother I was going to spend the day at Marcus's house, which was technically true, since we did meet up there first before riding our bikes the 2 miles out toward Cutler Road. Ellie was waiting for us at the end of her driveway, her backpack loaded down with a flashlight, an extra battery, her ghost storybook, and a disposable camera she had bought with her allowance specifically for the occasion. Looking back, I think some part of all three of us understood, even then, that we were about to do something that could not be undone, even if none of us would have admitted it out loud. Cutler Road ran along the edge of town before curving out into farmland, narrow and cracked, lined on either side by deep drainage ditches and fields of corn that had not yet grown tall enough to hide much of anything. We rode our bikes in a loose line, Marcus in front, then Ellie, then me trailing slightly behind, the only sound the whir of our tires and the occasional distant bark of a farm dog. The Blackmore house came into view gradually, first just a dark shape rising above the tree line, then more clearly as we drew closer, its sagging roof and broken windows exactly as unsettling as every story had described. We stopped our bikes at the edge of the overgrown driveway and simply stared at it for a long moment, none of us quite ready to be the first one to move forward. The driveway itself was little more than 2 ruts worn into the earth, choked on both sides with weeds and saplings that had clearly not been cleared in decades. We walked our bikes rather than riding them, laying them down finally in the tall grass near where the driveway widened into what had once been a front yard. Up close, the house was even more imposing than it had looked from the road, 3 full stories of gray weathered wood, its windows either boarded over or shattered entirely, dark gaps like missing teeth in a face that seemed, even then, to be somehow watching us approach. Marcus was the one who finally broke the silence, saying we should walk the perimeter first before deciding how to get inside, a suggestion that sounded reasonable enough that neither Ellie nor I argued with it. We circled the house slowly, staying a cautious distance from the walls, cataloging the possible entry points as we went. The front door was boarded shut with weathered planks nailed in a rough cross pattern, clearly meant to discourage exactly what we were planning to do. Around the back, however, we found a side door hanging half open on a single rusted hinge, the wood around the frame rotted enough that it looked as though the smallest push might bring the whole thing down. Ellie pulled her flashlight out of her backpack even though it was still daylight outside, saying it would be dark enough inside regardless of the hour. Marcus reached the door first and gave it a gentle push, and it swung inward with a long, low groan that seemed to echo far longer than it should have inside an empty house. The smell hit us before anything else, a thick and musty odor of mold and rotted wood and something else underneath it that none of us could quite name, something faintly sweet and unpleasant that made my stomach turn the moment I breathed it in. Marcus stepped inside first, sweeping his own flashlight beam across what had once been a kitchen, the counters long since collapsed, cabinet doors hanging open on broken hinges, a thick layer of dust and debris covering every surface. Ellie followed close behind him, her own light joining his, and I came last, glancing back once at the gray daylight behind us before stepping over the threshold into the dark. The moment my foot crossed into the house, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees, a cold that had nothing to do with the overcast sky outside. We moved slowly through the kitchen and into what must have once been a dining room, our flashlight beams catching on strange details that none of us commented on out loud, though I am certain we all noticed them. There was a long wooden table still standing in the center of the room, its surface warped and split with age but otherwise intact, and set upon it, impossibly, were 5 place settings, plates and bowls arranged with a precision that seemed to defy the 7 decades of abandonment surrounding them. There was no dust on the table, none at all, though every other surface in the house was buried under it. Marcus made a joke about the family being ready for dinner, and none of us laughed, and after that none of us spoke much above a whisper for a long time. Beyond the dining room, we found ourselves in a wide entry hall dominated by a staircase that curved up into darkness, its wooden banisters still largely intact despite the missing steps scattered throughout the flight. Ellie wanted to go upstairs immediately, insisting that was where the real story would be, but Marcus argued for exploring the ground floor first, reasoning that a staircase with missing steps was too risky to attempt without checking every alternative. I found myself agreeing with Marcus more out of a desire to delay the climb than any real concern for safety, though I told myself it was practical thinking. We moved instead toward a set of double doors on the far side of the entry hall, which opened, with considerable effort, into what had clearly once been a parlor or sitting room. The parlor was in far worse condition than the rooms before it, the ceiling sagging dangerously low in one corner where water damage had rotted the plaster through to the beams above. A large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, cold and dark, its mantel still holding a row of picture frames so caked with dust that the images inside them were impossible to make out clearly. Ellie insisted on wiping one clean with the sleeve of her jacket, and the three of us leaned in close to examine what the dim beam of her flashlight revealed. It was a family portrait, faded and yellowed with age, showing a stern-faced man and woman standing behind 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, none of them smiling, all of them staring directly into the camera with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. We were still examining the photograph when we heard it for the first time, a soft and deliberate creak from directly above us, the unmistakable sound of a footstep pressing down on an old wooden floor. All 3 of us froze completely, flashlight beams jerking upward toward the water-stained ceiling as though we might somehow see through it. The sound did not repeat immediately, and after a long tense silence, Marcus suggested, in a voice that was noticeably less confident than it had been an hour before, that it was probably just the house settling, old wood contracting and expanding with the temperature. Ellie agreed a little too quickly, and I said nothing at all, because I did not believe that explanation for a single second, and some part of me suspected they did not either. We continued through the ground floor despite the sound, driven forward by a stubbornness that I now recognize as one of the more dangerous qualities of being 12 years old, convinced that nothing truly terrible could ever happen to us. We found a small library off the back of the parlor, its shelves still lined with books whose spines had faded to a legible gray, and beyond that a narrow hallway leading toward what must have once been a back porch, now collapsed entirely and open to the overcast sky. Throughout all of it, that soft creaking continued intermittently above us, never in the same spot twice, moving in a way that suggested something walking slowly and deliberately across the second floor, tracking our progress through the rooms below. By the time we circled back to the base of the staircase, the light outside had begun to shift, the gray afternoon sky darkening slightly with the promise of evening still hours away but undeniably approaching. Ellie checked her watch and announced we had been inside for nearly 2 hours already, far longer than any of us had planned. Marcus, to his credit, was the first to suggest we should head home, that we had seen enough for one day and could always come back another time if we wanted to see more. I agreed immediately, relief flooding through me at the thought of leaving that house behind. It was Ellie, of all people, who hesitated, staring up the dark staircase with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between fear and an almost hungry curiosity. She said she wanted just 5 more minutes, just enough time to look up the staircase and confirm whether the missing steps made it passable at all, promising she would not actually attempt to climb it, only look. Marcus and I exchanged a glance, and though neither of us wanted to stay any longer, neither of us wanted to leave Ellie behind either. We followed her back to the base of the stairs, our flashlight beams sweeping up into the darkness above, and it was in that moment, all 3 lights converging on the same spot near the top of the staircase, that we saw her for the first time, a pale figure standing perfectly still at the top of the stairs, watching us with an expression I could not read from that distance. None of us moved. None of us spoke. The figure at the top of the stairs was small, child-sized, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress in a pattern too faded to make out clearly in our flashlight beams. She did not move, did not react to the light suddenly illuminating her, simply stood there at the edge of the darkness, watching us with a stillness that felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. Marcus was the one who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper, asking if anyone else was seeing what he was seeing. Ellie nodded slowly, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as her hand shook. I could not manage to speak at all. I could only stare up into the darkness at that small, unmoving shape, feeling a cold dread settle into my chest unlike anything I had ever experienced. The figure at the top of the stairs tilted her head slowly to one side, a small and simple movement that somehow radiated more menace than anything overtly threatening could have. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, bumping into me, and the sudden contact was enough to break whatever spell had been holding the 3 of us frozen in place. He said, in a voice cracking with fear, that we needed to leave right now, and for once neither Ellie nor I argued with him. We turned together and half ran, half stumbled back through the parlor and the dining room, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly off the walls, the sound of our own footsteps and ragged breathing the only thing filling the silence behind us. We burst out through the side door into the gray evening light, gasping, none of us stopping until we had crossed the entire overgrown yard and reached the spot where we had left our bikes at the edge of the driveway. I remember looking back at the house once, just once, and seeing nothing unusual, only the same sagging gray structure we had approached hours before, its broken windows staring back at us like empty eyes. We grabbed our bikes and rode away from Cutler Road as fast as our legs could pedal, not slowing down until we reached the edge of town, where the familiar sight of streetlights and ordinary houses finally allowed our racing hearts to begin settling back to something normal. We did not speak about what happened for the rest of that day, each of us retreating to our own homes in a kind of shell-shocked silence, none of us quite ready to put words to what we had seen. It was not until the following morning, when the three of us met up again at the gas station on Main Street, that anyone brought it up directly. Ellie was the first to speak, saying she had not slept at all the night before, that every time she closed her eyes she saw that small pale figure standing at the top of the stairs. Marcus admitted the same, and I confessed that I had left every light in my bedroom on through the entire night, something I had not done since I was much younger. I expected, given how thoroughly frightened all three of us had been, that this would be the end of it, that we would simply agree never to go near the Blackmore house again and move on with the rest of our summer. I was wrong. Ellie, predictably, was the one who suggested we needed to go back, arguing that we had left too many questions unanswered, that whoever or whatever that figure had been deserved a real explanation rather than the vague terror we had fled from the day before. Marcus, surprising me, agreed almost immediately, saying that if we were going to be scared of something for the rest of our lives, we should at least understand what it actually was. I argued against it as strongly as I could, but in the end, as always, I found myself outvoted and unwilling to let my friends go back without me. We planned the second visit more carefully than the first, agreeing to go on a Wednesday afternoon when we would have more daylight hours to work with, and bringing additional supplies this time, extra flashlights, a length of rope Marcus found in his garage, and a notebook Ellie insisted on bringing to document everything we found in more detail. I remember feeling a deep sense of dread as that Wednesday approached, a feeling that only intensified as we rode our bikes back out along Cutler Road, the Blackmore house rising into view exactly as unsettling as it had been days before, though something about it felt different this time, as though the house itself had been waiting for our return. We approached the side door with far more hesitation than we had shown on our first visit, none of us quite as eager to step over that threshold a second time. Ellie finally pushed it open, and the same musty, sweetly rotten smell rolled out to greet us, exactly as it had before. We moved through the kitchen and dining room quickly this time, barely pausing to look at the strange place settings still arranged with their impossible precision on the warped wooden table. Our goal, as we had agreed, was the staircase, and specifically whatever answers might be waiting on the second floor, though none of us said the word ghost out loud, as though avoiding the word might somehow keep the reality of what we had seen at bay. We reached the base of the staircase and stood there for a long moment, flashlight beams sweeping up into the darkness above, finding nothing this time, no small pale figure watching from the top. Marcus suggested this was either a good sign or a very bad one, and none of us could decide which. Ellie was the one who finally stepped onto the first stair, testing it carefully with her weight before committing fully, and when it held, she continued upward, testing each step in turn, avoiding the gaps where boards had long since rotted away or fallen entirely. Marcus followed close behind her, and I came last, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat with every single step. The second-floor hallway stretched before us in near total darkness, our 3 flashlight beams the only illumination against walls covered in faded and peeling wallpaper, a pattern of small flowers barely visible beneath decades of grime. Several doors lined the hallway on either side, most hanging open, revealing small empty bedrooms stripped of furniture except for the occasional broken bed frame or overturned dresser. The air up here felt even colder than it had below, and every few steps I found myself glancing back over my shoulder, certain I could feel something watching us from the darkness behind, though every time I turned my light there was nothing there. We had checked 3 of the bedrooms, finding nothing beyond decay and dust, when Ellie stopped abruptly outside a 4th door at the very end of the hallway, this one closed completely, unlike every other door we had encountered. She reached out and tried the handle, and to our surprise it turned easily, the door swinging inward with none of the resistance we had expected from decades of disuse. Beyond it was a small bedroom, smaller than the others we had seen, containing a single narrow bed still made with a thin and moth-eaten blanket, and on the wall above it, a child's drawing, faded but still visible, depicting 5 stick figures standing in front of a house, one of them crossed out entirely with heavy, jagged lines. Ellie stepped closer to examine the drawing, pulling her notebook from her backpack to sketch a quick copy of it, while Marcus wandered further into the room to check a small closet set into the far wall. I stayed near the door, unable to shake the feeling that something in this room was different from the others, some heaviness in the air that pressed down on my chest and made it difficult to draw a full breath. Marcus pulled the closet door open and immediately took a sharp step backward, his flashlight beam illuminating something inside that made him swear under his breath, a phrase our mothers would not have approved of. Ellie and I both rushed over to see what had startled him so badly. Inside the closet, carved into the wood of the back wall with what must have taken enormous time and effort, were dozens of tally marks, hundreds of them, scratched deep into the wood in uneven rows. Beneath the tally marks, in smaller and more careful lettering, someone had carved a single sentence that none of us could fully process at first glance. It read, in halting and childish script, that someone kept them from leaving and that the counting was the only way to remember how long they had been trapped. Ellie's hand trembled as she copied the words into her notebook, and Marcus closed the closet door slowly, as though afraid of what might happen if he moved too quickly. We stood in that small bedroom for a long moment, none of us speaking, the weight of what we had just read settling over all 3 of us like a physical thing. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence, suggesting in a shaky voice that we had seen enough, that whatever had happened in this house was clearly far worse than any of the campfire stories had ever suggested, and that we should leave immediately and never come back. For once, none of us argued. We turned to head back toward the hallway, and it was in that moment that the bedroom door, which had been standing open behind us the entire time, slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls and plunged us briefly into total darkness before our flashlights caught up with our own startled reactions. Ellie rushed to the door and grabbed the handle, twisting it hard, but it refused to budge, held fast as though something on the other side were pressing against it with enormous weight. Marcus joined her, throwing his shoulder against the wood, and together they managed to force it open perhaps an inch before it slammed shut again with the same violent force as before. I stood frozen near the closet, my flashlight beam sweeping the small room in a rising panic, searching for any other way out, finding nothing but a single small window set high in the far wall, far too small and far too high for any of us to reach without help. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, cold enough that I could see my own breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight, and a low sound began to build somewhere beyond the walls, not quite a voice and not quite a wind, something in between that seemed to be forming words just beyond the edge of comprehension. Ellie and Marcus continued throwing themselves against the door, and on their 3rd attempt it finally gave way, swinging open so suddenly that both of them stumbled forward into the hallway beyond. I did not hesitate. I bolted after them, my flashlight beam jumping wildly as I ran, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that small room and whatever had been holding the door shut against us. We ran for the staircase without stopping, our earlier caution about missing steps forgotten entirely in the grip of pure animal panic. Marcus went down first, nearly losing his footing on a rotted board but catching himself against the banister just in time. Ellie followed, and I came last, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite the very real danger of the gaps between them. We hit the ground floor running and did not slow down through the parlor, the dining room, or the kitchen, bursting out through the side door into the gray evening light with a force that sent the rotted wood cracking loudly behind us. We did not stop running until we reached our bikes, and even then it took several long minutes before any of us could catch our breath enough to speak coherently. Ellie was crying, something I had never seen her do before, not even when she had broken her arm falling out of a tree 2 summers earlier. Marcus kept glancing back toward the house, his face pale and drawn, muttering that we were never, under any circumstances, going back there again. I agreed with him completely, my hands still shaking too badly to properly grip my bike's handlebars for several minutes after we finally started the ride home. For nearly 2 weeks after that second visit, none of us spoke about the Blackmore house at all, an unspoken agreement settling over the three of us that some things were better left buried. We resumed our normal summer activities, swimming at the community pool, riding bikes to the ice cream stand downtown, doing everything we could to fill our days with enough ordinary distraction that the memory of that carved closet and the slammed door might begin to fade. It did not fade, not really, not for any of us, though we each dealt with it differently. Ellie kept her notebook locked in a drawer in her room, refusing to look at it again. Marcus started sleeping with his bedroom light on, something he would have been mortified to admit to anyone outside our small group. It was Ellie who broke the unspoken agreement first, showing up at my house on a rainy afternoon in mid-July with her notebook clutched against her chest and an expression on her face that told me immediately something had changed. She said she had gone back to the library and found more information, older newspaper clippings that had not come up in her earlier research, articles about a fourth Blackmore child, one that had never been mentioned in any of the stories we had grown up hearing, a child who according to the records had died in that house years before the rest of the family vanished entirely, under circumstances the old articles described only vaguely as accidental. She believed, and by the time she finished explaining her theory I found myself believing it too, that the small pale figure we had seen at the top of the stairs was not simply a ghost in the vague and general sense the town stories had always suggested, but something far more specific and far more angry, a child who had died alone in that house and who had perhaps been responsible, in whatever way spirits are capable of such things, for what had eventually happened to the rest of the family. Marcus, when we told him, was far less interested in the historical explanation and far more insistent that regardless of the why, the answer remained the same. We needed to stay away from that house permanently, and he could not understand why Ellie seemed to want to return there again despite everything we had already experienced. The disagreement between Ellie and Marcus grew heated enough that for the first time in all the years I had known them, I genuinely worried our friendship might not survive it. Ellie argued that we owed it to whatever remained trapped in that house, whether it be angry spirit or lingering echo, to understand the full truth of what had happened, insisting that leaving the mystery unresolved would only mean other kids in the future might stumble into the same danger we had barely escaped. Marcus argued, with increasing frustration, that curiosity had already nearly gotten us killed once, and that continuing to poke at something so clearly dangerous was not brave, only reckless. I found myself caught in the middle, unable to fully agree with either of them, though privately I leaned far closer to Marcus's side of the argument. In the end, it was a single piece of information that convinced even Marcus to reconsider his position, though he remained deeply unhappy about it. Ellie had discovered, buried in one of the oldest newspaper archives she could find, a brief mention of a house fire that had occurred at the Blackmore property nearly a decade before we were born, a fire that local authorities had at the time attributed to faulty wiring, but which several witnesses quoted in the article insisted had begun without any visible source, spreading unnaturally fast through a house that by all accounts should have burned to the ground and yet somehow survived largely. In fact, the article's final line, which Ellie read aloud to us in a hushed and shaking voice, mentioned that the fire department's official report noted the sound of a child crying from somewhere inside the house throughout the entire incident, despite there being no children present on the property that night. We decided, against every ounce of good judgment any of us possessed, to make one final trip to the Blackmore house before the end of summer, telling ourselves it would be the last time, that we would simply confirm what Ellie's research suggested and then leave the house and its secrets behind forever. We chose a Sunday afternoon, reasoning that the extra daylight hours and the general sense of the day being safer somehow would work in our favor, though looking back I recognize now how little any of that mattered against whatever waited for us inside those walls. We rode out to Cutler Road one final time, the familiar dread settling over all three of us the moment the house came into view above the tree line. This time, we did not bother with the kitchen or the dining room, moving directly toward the staircase with a grim determination that left little room for our earlier hesitation. Ellie wanted to return to the small bedroom at the end of the second-floor hallway, believing that whatever answers remained were most likely to be found there, near the carved tally marks and the desperate message scratched into the closet wall. We climbed the stairs together this time, refusing to separate even for a moment, our flashlight beams sweeping constantly in every direction as we made our way down the darkened hallway toward that same closed door. The door stood open when we reached it, exactly as we had left it during our panicked escape weeks before, and the small bedroom beyond looked undisturbed, the narrow bed and faded child's drawing exactly as we remembered them. Ellie moved immediately to the closet, pulling the door open to examine the tally marks and carved message once more, running her fingers gently over the deep grooves in the old wood. It was as she knelt there, tracing the letters with her fingertips, that the temperature in the room began to drop again, sharp and sudden, and the same low sound from before began building somewhere beyond the walls, closer this time, more insistent. We turned toward the door just as it began swinging shut on its own, and this time Marcus moved fast enough to catch it before it could close completely, wedging his own body into the gap with a strength born entirely of desperation. Beyond him, in the hallway, the small pale figure stood watching us once more, closer now than she had been on our first visit, close enough that I could finally make out details I had missed before, a face far too gaunt and hollow to belong to any living child, eyes that held nothing but a deep and endless sorrow beneath the fear that also seemed to live there. She raised one thin arm and pointed not at us, but past us, toward the small window high on the closet wall, and in that moment, somehow, all three of us understood exactly what she was trying to tell us. We ran for that door the instant Marcus wrestled it fully open, pushing past the small figure without touching her, feeling only a wave of impossible cold as we passed. We did not look back as we sprinted down the hallway and the staircase, through the ground floor rooms, and out into the blinding daylight beyond the side door, our lungs burning, our legs carrying us faster than they ever had before. We rode home in silence, and none of us ever returned to the Blackmore house again. To this day, none of us has ever fully explained to anyone else what we saw in that final moment, what the small girl at the top of the stairs was warning us about, or whether, by finally listening and running when she pointed us toward the way out, we somehow gave her the only thing she had been trying to ask of us all along, someone willing to believe her and leave before it was too late. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. If so, subscribe for more. I make new videos every day. I'll see you in the next one.